Hey guys, I'm coming at you for another video, and I'm going to try to find a spot here to film. This one is going to be on the problems with Hong Kong, because there is a perception that there are less and less opportunities for some of the youngsters in Hong Kong, while on the Shenzhen side there's more and more opportunities. There's a booming tech sector, and why is Shenzhen moving forward without the Hong Kong youth? Obviously, there's other issues too in terms of housing affordability. A lot of the apartments are getting smaller and smaller. This video is going to be similar to the last one in the sense that it's kind of on the fly. It's not really planned out. I prefer planning videos out, but a lot of people said they preferred my last video. So bear in mind that it's going to be basically just touching the surface. There's probably going to be a lot of rabbit holes that get opened up that I don't travel down, and I might miss some of the finer details. But again, it's going to be similar to the last video, where it's more of a informal kind of a conversation. Okay guys, I think I found a pretty good spot here to make the video, and I will continue from here. Now, the last video I made was kind of on the fly, and this is somewhat as well, but a lot of the things I mentioned deserved additional context. One of the things I said was that Hong Kong is a good place. And it is in many regards, in the ways that you would measure how good a place is. I mean, it was one of the safest cities in the world. It has the longest life expectancies. It has something like 1/5 or 1/6 the incarceration rate of the US, free health care, even the prescription drugs, most of them are free, including multi-million-dollar gene therapy drugs. That was actually something I had been trying to do quite a while before these protests started. I was trying to get the Hong Kong government to bring a gene therapy drug to Hong Kong for spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, because there's a few hundred sufferers in Hong Kong. And I had sent emails to the hospital authority, to actually a pro-democracy politician, ironically enough. And I didn't get any responses, but in the end, Carrie Lam did approve it, and she brought it to Hong Kong. And that's a very expensive drug. I mean, it's $700,000 US for the first year, and then you still have to continue paying hundreds of thousands of dollars every year after that, for as long as the sufferer, the patient, is alive. Now, I want to be clear about something. That wasn't from my efforts, although I tried to help out. The real star of that story was a girl called Josie Chow, I believe it was. She did a lot of activism around this. She penned I believe it was a 22-page letter to Carrie Lam asking for her to bring this drug to Hong Kong. She's a sufferer of SMA, and it finally did work. And actually, that's something I always wondered about, what Josie's opinion would be on what's going on in Hong Kong. Here she is she's this girl who's getting a multi-million-dollar drug provided to her by the Hong Kong government, something that parents in the US would just dream of having for their kids. Many of them don't have access to this drug. And everyone around her is telling her how bad Hong Kong is. And the protesters are destroying disability entrances for people like her to the subways, and are destroying the sound devices on crosswalks for visually impaired people. For what reason, I don't know why, but I would be really curious what she would have to say about that. I'm guessing she wouldn't get involved in politics, but it's an interesting thought anyways. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. Let's bring it back in here. So one of those problems, or a few of those problems, would be the housing, the wealth gap issues, upward momentum ability for those who are kind of struggling in the lower class areas. One of my friends put it really well. He said that, people are living in 300 square foot apartments in Hong Kong, and they're building smaller and smaller apartments. He says, you can only have somebody living like a caged animal for so long before they just explode. And it's so true with how small some of these apartments are in Hong Kong. I mean, the Hong Kong botanical and zoological gardens, the animals living there have more space than a lot of people in Hong Kong have, and it's a serious problem. But this is actually a problem that actually comes from the tycoons, and the tycoons in Hong Kong, they got their power from the British. The tycoons under the British system were always prioritized. Even when things were done that looked like it was for the people on the surface, really was with their best interests in mind, these tycoons. For example, even the public housing programs that were introduced, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, it was designed in such a way where people right at the bottom were getting these subsidized housing apartments, and the businesses in Hong Kong were really benefiting from it, because what happened was it took the pressure off of the businesses to increase their salaries, and basically created a system that was essentially dormitories, subsidized dormitories for these companies. So people in the lowest end jobs, it was designed in such a way that they could just never get ahead. Now that might be a problem that's faced with any public housing system, no matter how you look at it, but definitely the way that things were done, it's not only from that example, it looks like that everything was designed around the tycoons or the people in power in mind, not for the ordinary person. So how these tycoons became even more powerful than they already were before was when the British realized that they couldn't keep Hong Kong. What they did was they did what they can do to make money, their last bit of money from Hong Kong, which was started selling land off like crazy to 4 of the powerful kind of families, the powerful groups in Hong Kong. That was Henderson Land Group, SHK Properties, CK Asset Holdings, and New World Development. Those are the 4 companies. And they were selling actually at such an alarming rate that Beijing had to come in and negotiate with them and say, okay, slow down. You can only sell 50 acres per year until handover, to try to kind of put a cap on it. But by the time that happened, these 4 companies pretty much owned Hong Kong. I mean, everything now from a lot of the utilities, the container ports, the pharmacies, the electronics stores, transport, so many things these tycoons basically own in Hong Kong. So you could say in some ways that the British didn't really hand Hong Kong back to China, they sold it to these tycoons. So one of the things that happens is that these tycoons and these cartels, whatever you want to call them, they use their power to squeeze people out of the market. And you hear about this all the time with people creating businesses, everything's going really well, and then you kind of get these landlords or these tycoons coming in and really limiting their growth. Particularly if it overlaps with these tycoons' businesses. And I don't think it's any coincidence when you have Carrefour, you have Uber being squeezed out. These are all encroaching into the territories and the business areas of these tycoons that have a really tight grip on Hong Kong. So one of the other things they do is they squat on properties and they artificially control the supply and demand to really push prices up. And the interesting thing is with the mainland system, you don't have that problem. They come in and they just reform. They just say, you know what, no, this isn't for the good of the people. And as an example of that, in Shenzhen, if you buy a commercial property, you have somewhere around the range of 6 to 7 years that you've got to develop that property. And if you don't, there's going to be penalties, there's going to be all kinds of issues. You don't have that in Hong Kong. And that's definitely to the benefit of those tycoons. They can, like I said, sit on that property, let the prices go up, and then slowly release properties into the market as they see fit. So do you really think an open voting system would solve that problem? Something more in the US's direction? And you know, what was it? I remember hearing the latest number that some of these, to win a U.S. Senate seat, some people are spending in excess of $15 million US. And when you have a system like that, you've got to ask yourself, what kind of a return on investment are they expecting for themselves and their donors? Because it's not going to come from their salary. Their salary is never going to cover that amount of money. And you see that in practice when you see policies being made to benefit big business. I mean, high-speed rail is one of the really popular topics in terms of what China does well, right? You know, in the last 10 years, they've built 25,000 kilometers of subway line. In that same period of time, they've been talking about building a 190-kilometer line in California, which is still, I think, needs, I don't know how many more years to finish. And speaking of rail, that's one of the examples I want to share is, what was it? It was in the 60s or 70s also, where you had these oil companies and these car companies who went in and bought up transit systems like streetcar systems and stuff like that just to destroy them so that they could pave over them and make more roads. I mean, that's not in the greater interest of, that's not in the interest of the greater good, is it? Now, if you listen to that example and you think, okay, so forget the high-speed rail in China. If you think overall China's system would be worse in that regard, in terms of power being concentrated with people who have money or power, I actually want to play you a clip from Eric Lee. He did a TED Talk. It's a brilliant TED Talk. I'll put the link in the description on China's political system. So here, let's have a listen first.
The second assumption is that in a one-party state, power gets concentrated in the hands of the few, and bad governance and corruption follow. Indeed, corruption is a big problem, but let's first look at the larger context. Now, this may be counterintuitive to you. The party happens to be one of the most meritocratic political institutions in the world today. China's highest ruling body, the Politburo, has 25 members. In the most recent one, only 5 of them came from background of privilege, so-called princelings. The other 20, including the president and the premier, came from entirely ordinary backgrounds. In the larger central committee of 300 or more, the percentage of those who were born into power and wealth was even smaller. The vast majority of senior Chinese leaders worked and competed their way to the top. Compare that with the ruling elites in both developed and developing countries, I think you'll find the party being near the top in upward mobility.
So it's probably quite different from what you thought originally, isn't it? So now, you know who would really like to see universal suffrage, though, and who would really like to see a vote? It's these tycoons. They already, as it is, a lot of these very powerful, rich and powerful people in Hong Kong, as it is, they already contribute millions of dollars to candidates in the district elections. And you can be sure that the day Hong Kong is granted universal suffrage and can vote for their own leader, that influence is going to go all the way to the top, right to the person that's elected to run Hong Kong. They dream of the day that Hong Kong has a system like the US's, where special interest groups and the highest bidder really are the people who determine the kinds of policies that are pushed through in a society. Beijing, of course, sees this very clearly. They can see that what will happen if universal suffrage is granted, not only in terms of these tycoons basically running Hong Kong even more so than they are now, but in terms of the national security issues around kind of having Hong Kong align themselves with the US even more. So what they did, though, was they said, okay, we've made this commitment to try to work towards universal suffrage, work our way towards universal suffrage when the conditions are right. So let's take a first step. And it was in, I believe it was June 2015, somewhere in and around there, they held a vote to say, all right, our first step in this direction is going to be, we are going to pre-screen some candidates, and you're going to be able to choose from those candidates. And so, of course, those candidates are going to be pre-screened to make sure that it does act as a buffer to prevent these tycoons from taking over, and to make sure that the national security interests of China are basically kept in mind. And the pro-democracy parties voted against it. Basically, they couldn't push it through. That's probably something you're surprised by also, that what Beijing says doesn't necessarily happen in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong kind of does it their own way. And that's a testament to their autonomy. You've seen that most recently with the overturning of the face mask ban. Now, there might be some issues with that we're going to probably see come up soon. But you also see it as early as just over handover, when Beijing said to Hong Kong, they said that they wanted Hong Kong to interpret the law in such a way that the babies of mainland mothers who are not residents of Hong Kong would not get a Hong Kong ID card, would not get Hong Kong residency, a passport, whatever you want to call it. And Hong Kong ruled against it. They said, no, we're going to give them our passports, their passports. They're going to be local residents. Macau did follow Beijing's interpretation. And to this day, if a mainland mother goes over there to give birth, the baby will not get a Macau passport. The irony in that is that one of the issues that Hong Kong people has is with immigrants from mainland. And this was an issue where Beijing actually said, you know, they saw this problem long before it happened and tried to help Hong Kong with it. But because they don't have that power in Hong Kong, they couldn't force them to not give them these passports. They let Hong Kong do it their way. So back onto the main point. What can Beijing do if they don't have any meaningful power in Hong Kong? And which they don't. What they can do is they can give Hong Kong people unprecedented access to the mainland. Whether they want to use it or not, it's up to them. I'll give you some examples of that. So if a Hong Kong person wants to come to Shenzhen, wants to live in Shenzhen, their kids can get free access to the schools. That's something that even somebody in a neighboring city, a kid from Dongguan or a kid from Huizhou, any of the neighboring cities, they can't do that freely. They can't just show up to Shenzhen and say, okay, I want my kids to go to the school here. You have to have official residency in Shenzhen. You have to have a local hukou. Basically, it's this household booklet system. So Hong Kong people have that, first of all. Second, if taxes in Hong Kong are some of the lowest in the world. That's another reason why Hong Kong is a pretty good place in that regard. But it has some of the lowest tax rates in the world. If they come to Shenzhen and they want to work in Shenzhen, there's a program that allows them to apply to pay their lower Hong Kong tax rate while they're working in Shenzhen. So they'll be working alongside local people here, but paying less tax than them. They have the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a system that allows for duty-free trade of goods that are made in Hong Kong or put together in Hong Kong over to China. They have an advanced customs clearance system that other countries would just die to have. I mean, they have such good access to doing business with China as well. They have the Greater Bay Area project, which prioritized the financial industry in Hong Kong. The Greater Bay Area project basically made this whole area of Guangdong part of a program, and each area was going to have its specialty. And Hong Kong was really a star of the show as kind of becoming the financial hub of that. And so that's kind of giving opportunities to Hong Kong in that regard as well. They have an educational scheme for Hong Kongers who do want to go to some of the best universities in China if they choose to do so, like some of the really good universities in Beijing or elsewhere. They basically, the requirements for Hong Kong people, the score that they are required to have is far lower than that of mainland Chinese. It's much easier for them to enter these universities. If you want to open up a wholly owned foreign enterprise in China, they've made Hong Kong one of the easiest places to do that from, even easier than Singapore or any of the other neighboring countries. They gave Hong Kong priority for this. For reform in renminbi, for the currency reform, being able to trade renminbi or do certain transactions in renminbi, Hong Kong is the place that's chosen for that as well. This is all coming from Beijing, giving Hong Kong financial relevance. Even a couple of weeks ago, the Beijing government introduced 16 new measures to give Hong Kong people favorable benefits in mainland China, including surrounding property purchases and a number of other things. So what could Hong Kong people have done? Well, instead of spending all that time telling the world how much better they are than mainlanders, at least a big portion of them, while China and even Shenzhen has slowly been outpacing Hong Kong, Shenzhen's GDP outpaced that of Hong Kong's recently, they could have pushed for more cooperation. There is a free trade zone between Shenzhen and Hong Kong in Futian district. They could have expanded more on that. Could you imagine if during the tech boom, when Tencent and all of these companies were booming in Shenzhen, if it was the Hong Kong people that said, wait, why don't we do something together? Why don't we do something in the new territories, have a joint control area where, you know, Hong Kong people can go and work in the tech sector, Chinese people can go and work in the tech sector and have this cooperation. But you're not going to see that happen with a group of people who are so convinced that they shouldn't have anything to do with China, or at least they should reduce their ties with China, and that, like I said, they believe that they're far better than China. But the Hong Kong government couldn't even begin imagining doing something like this with the amount of animosity there is towards mainland and the idea of cooperating with mainland more. And I want to get back to one other point in regards to what is the mainland doing in the absence of having real power in Hong Kong. An interesting development happened a few weeks back. Some of those property developers, 3 of those 4 major groups that I talked about earlier, donated millions of square feet of land to the Hong Kong government for housing projects. And if you look at those press conferences where they're announcing the land that they're donating, they don't look too happy. They don't look happy about it. And my theory, of course, I don't know if this is true or not, but my own theory is that Beijing has been accused all the time of using soft power in Hong Kong. And so maybe they got to a point where they said, all right, you know what? If we're going to be accused of using soft power all the time, we'll use it. And we'll use it to fix these problems. Because those property developers, they have big projects in mainland. Their mainland business now arguably is more important than their Hong Kong business. So it would be pretty easy to put some pressure on them to say, hey, you know that land you've been holding on to for years and years and years in Hong Kong? It's time to hand it over. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not going to get into that, but that's a possible thing that's happening behind the scenes too, where Beijing is trying to say, all right, we got to do something. 你是深圳人吗？哦，本地人。
可以说是吧。
嗯，对，来自深圳就是深圳人，对吧？那我应该也是。你不要打个招呼在里面。这个不是现在发的，是等一下发的。
等一下发给谁
？Hello. Okay, so I had another couple of people come up to me to talk to me, just like in yesterday's video. And it's funny because in yesterday's video I was talking about how friendly people are in Shenzhen, and literally every video I've tried to make outside here, I've had people come up to me to talk to me. But anyways, now I'm going to have to re-find where I left off. So in regards to the this kind of anti-mainland sentiment that makes it really hard to push through meaningful cooperative projects between Hong Kong and Shenzhen for the greater good and the prosperity of both sides together, and for Hong Kong to participate even more with mainland's prosperity, is made even more difficult by the same people and the same tycoons who donate to these political parties. And actually, a lot of these really wealthy guys who donate to political parties, in their own media, they produce very xenophobic anti-mainland content. And this has been going on long before these protests. And even in the Hong Kong schools' liberal arts studies, their books are just full of anti-mainland stuff, talking about how mainlanders or mainland China can't be trusted, how it's a bad force in the world, how it's just a terrible place. All the meanwhile, China's improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people. They're closing the wealth gap. They're doing all kinds of great stuff, while just Hong Kong is being continually brainwashed to say, no, that's not somebody we want to be associated with. So that's one of the reasons it's really hard to push through meaningful cooperation and meaningful projects that come from Beijing to say, hey, Hong Kong, this is what we can do for you. The idea that Hong Kong is more important than China or better than China, whatever you want to say, and that Hong Kong is really, really important to China, is something that's echoed by people like Joshua Wong. Even, he says it all the time on his Twitter. He even said it in U.S. Senate, how the CCP funds itself through Hong Kong. And he's trying to paint this picture that Hong Kong is amazing and important on its own, and it's got nothing to do with China. And it's completely backwards thinking. I mean, the reason Hong Kong is successful is because it's on the doorstep of China. It was the place to do business with China. And it continues to have financial relevance because of Beijing. Because Beijing is saying, this is where we're going to do our renminbi from. This is where it's going to be easier to open up a wholly owned foreign enterprise from. This is where, they funnel most of, when foreign companies want to invest in China, over 50% of the foreign direct investment in China comes through Hong Kong. That's not because Hong Kong's amazing. That's not because foreign countries put restrictions on investing directly in China. It's because China pushes it through there. Getting back to my original point, to tie it into my point, this idea that they are so much better and this idea of self-importance, it creates a very difficult environment for Beijing to use the little power they do have surrounding their ability to help Hong Kong effectively. So to finish this off, I'll say that there are, of course, real problems in Hong Kong, but the perceived solutions that everybody's talking about will actually make the situation worse. The actual ways to fix this it's obviously very difficult considering the hold that these tycoons have on Hong Kong, and perhaps we'll start to see Beijing to try to fix this through soft influence, like we're seeing with those land donations. But the other solution lies with the people of Hong Kong and a complete shift in the way they think, and by taking a reality check, by really taking a more honest look at the actual problems in Hong Kong. So that's it for me. I'm going to leave it here. What I'll probably do is, it's a beautiful day out here today, and I'm going to finish with a shot of the Shenzhen Bay Park here.